May marks the beginning of Mental Health Awareness Month. This year's theme, Turn Awareness into Action, challenges each of us to go beyond simply recognizing mental health struggles. It calls us to engage, to support, and to advocate. Our featured speaker today is someone who many of us recognize from the gridiron, especially in the shoe, where action is always front and center. But today, Coach Ryan Day brings us a different kind of action, one rooted in honesty, vulnerability, and courage. Coach Day has chosen to share his personal journey with mental health openly and powerfully. Through this advocacy, he reminds us that true leadership isn't just about what happens on the field, it's also about making an impact off of it. This is action through advocacy in its most meaningful form. Please join me in welcoming Coach Ryan Day.
It's an honor to be here today. I want to thank the Daniels family for having me here today and for your leadership in the community, in this area. It means a lot to me to be a part of this community. And when I did join this community, I learned quickly the philanthropy that goes on here in Columbus. And we are leaders in mental health across the country. I don't know how many in this room are aware of that, but Columbus is the leader across the country in mental health. And I think it's a sense of pride for all of us. And so today, as I talked to Bruce a long time ago, and I thought that maybe the best thing to do in terms of mental health was to tell my story a little bit, why I got myself involved with this here in Columbus. But then, because I'm involved with mental health, a lot of people ask my wife and I questions about it, and I'm not a psychiatrist and I'm not a psychologist. So a lot of this stuff I don't know, but I can share my experiences and what I see, and that's what I'm going to do today. So, the reason I got myself involved and Nina decided to get us involved was when I first became the head coach at Ohio State. I was on a recruiting visit in Massillon, Ohio, up in Stark County, and I was doing a normal visit. It was about this time of year, kind of like a day like today. I walked in and there was nobody in the school. There was a high school coach there, and I said, "Where is everybody today?" They said, "Well, they canceled school because there was another suicide here in the school." And it was, I can't remember if it was 4 or 5, but it was like a number that just kind of took me off of my seat. And so after the conversation, I left and met with the recruits and met with the coach. And I got in the car and I called my wife right away. I said, "Something's wrong." I said, this is just not right. Why are young people taking their lives at such a wild rate? Like, this is just not, we need to get involved. And so about a week later, Nina, heard about what was then called On Our Sleeves, a nationwide children's, and decided that we wanted to do that. But part of that was for me to tell my story about growing up. And that was something that I had never done before. And so that challenged me because we all know the stigma surrounding mental health. And so that was a challenge. It was not easy for my family back home. It wasn't easy for me, but I did it because I think it's important. We all have to be leaders in this area. We all have to show vulnerability, and so I did. And the story is this: so I grew up in Manchester, New Hampshire, in a mill town where mostly the folks there were Greek, Irish, and French, And so when I was 9 years old living in this community, I was home one day after school and the police showed up at the house and my father had passed away. Well, what I didn't know was how that happened. And so for about a year, I thought it was an accident. And then I found out about a year later that he had taken his life. And so for a young person at 9 years old, there's just so many things they're going through your mind. You realize that if somebody isn't telling you what happened, there's shame surrounding what happened. And then you have to pick up the pieces afterwards and try to figure out what would force your father to do something like that and leave 3 young kids around. And so going through that process at a young age, there was a lot of things that I saw. My wife is from our same hometown, and in our hometown, nobody would talk about it. Not just that, but just mental health in general. And so during my youth, I went through a lot of confusion, trying to understand why my father would do that. And there's resentment, there's anger. There was a point in my life where I thought he was just mentally weak, And then as you get older, you realize that, he was sick. Who would do that? Who was in right mind? And so that combined with the fact that nobody talked about it. And so as we got back together, my wife and I, we just realized that, there's a generation of young people here that, we don't need anybody suffering in silence anymore. And so being a voice for that and getting behind these causes was important to Nina and I. So we got involved with Nationwide Children's, which is now called the Kids Mental Health Foundation, and they're doing great work. As many of you know, what they're doing downtown, it's the only behavioral health hospital in the country for adolescents and teenagers in crisis. And people fly in from all parts of the world to learn right here in Columbus how they're doing it. And it's very hard to get a room there because that's how busy it is, unfortunately. And we are making progress, but we got a long way to go. And a big part of that is breaking stigmas as surrounding mental health is, again, we know. And then Nina and I got involved at Ohio State. Dr. Fawn in the Behavioral Health Department at Ohio State is part of a great study. And so we decided to put a fund together at Ohio State around resilience because I was getting a little bit worn down with when people would talk about mental health, it was a heavy subject because the first thing people talk about is suicide. And it was like, just kind of, it wears on you a little bit. So we try to flip it a little bit and we talk about, resilience. And so the fund that we have at Ohio State is about building resilience. And so Dr. Fawn over at Ohio State is part of a case study right now that's looking to identify what are the issues that are causing mental health issues in our society. So we're very proud to be a part of that. But really, to me, what I wanted to share was just as I get an opportunity to be around a lot of these conversations and hear people speak in this area, but then also see 3 young kids go through elementary, middle school, high school, and then watching our players, navigate college in a very high-pressured environment, some of the things that we've been able to recognize. And I think the thing for me, again, hopefully you can follow this conversation, but I believe that there is physical health and mental health. And we all know how to handle our physical health. Not that we have every answer, we haven't cured cancer, but we have a very good idea on how to get physically healthy. What we don't do is look at mental health the same way. So, if you think about your physical health, you go to the gym, you get stronger, you eat well, you cut weight, you do all these things for your physical body. If you go to the doctor every year to get a checkup to see how things are going. If you break your leg, you go to the ER. If you have something wrong with your skin, you go to the dermatologist. If something's wrong with your teeth, you go to the dentist. I mean, we have a plan for how all of those things work. And we know how to build resilience up physically. If you want to get in better shape, what do? You run. And how do you train for a marathon? You run more. If you want to run a sprint, you work on sprints. If you want to get stronger in the weight room, what do? You lift weights. Well, what about mentally? We don't look at it the same way. At least, that's what I see. Mentally, we have to have the same mentality that we're building up our minds to be strong. But there are different layers to it. And Dr. Fawn's doing a great job over at Ohio State identifying what those things are. The last part of mental health is overdose or suicide. When you get so sick that you're going to take your life or you're going to go to put drugs in your body to overdose and pass away, that's the last the last thing that happens, when you're mentally sick. But there are all these other manifestations along the way that we can recognize. There's drug use, there's alcohol abuse, there's, different levels to all these things. And so when you think about mental health, you hear about schizophrenia, you hear about depression, you hear about OCD, you hear about bipolar disorder. There are things that people are predisposed to or chemically have. And just like if somebody has bad blood, cholesterol, or maybe they're predisposed to a certain illness physically, and when you go to the doctor, they ask you, did your parents have these types of things? Well, it's the same thing that happens medically, and some people need medicine to help with their cholesterol. The same thing, people need medicine to help them mentally. But again, I don't know if we're there yet. We're still trying to work through that. I know that we really embrace this at Ohio State with our football players. If somebody's sick, we try to get them the help they need. Maybe it's medicine, maybe it's counseling, maybe it's treatment, maybe it's just a good talk. But if we can somehow get to the point where we perceive physical health and mental health the same way, then I think we're going to be making the right step forward, and we're not going to see people suffering in silence. We're not going to see, the shame that comes with all of these things. And we're going to have ways to communicate, especially with young people, because it's very the statistics are very clear that a lot of mental health issues start at a young age. So we need to get involved and make sure that these young people understand that this is just as important. When you bring them to go to the dentist, or you bring them to go to the doctor, and your pediatrician, it should be the same thing as we're talking about with mental health. And I think the mistake that's been made over the years, I think about growing up in the town that I grew up in, and if somebody was crying or upset or not being strong or going through a tough time, it was just this mentality like, come on man, toughen up, let's go, get through it. But that's for the right, and the best way I can describe it is this: if someone's sitting on a bench press, right, and they stand on the bench press and they're trying to lift 350 pounds and they can't do it, you can't just say get tough. Now, let's say they can lift 135 pounds and they only do 2 and they rack it, and they could have done 4 or 5. Yeah, they got to get tougher. They have to build resilience up. But some people just can't physically do it or mentally do it. And so, I think these are all the ways that we have to look at this, because certainly some people just can't handle certain things and they have to get stronger and they have to build this resilience up. As hard as last season was for our team, we couldn't have wrote a better script if you're trying to look at mental health and build resilience up. I don't know, how many people followed, just exactly how our team went, but I think most of you did. And we went through that Oregon game. That was not easy. We lose that game on the road. And around here, as you know, a lot of finger pointing goes on, and we got to come back together. And then we lose the last game of the year, and it was humiliating. And so we have to come back together and figure that out. But we built resilience. And then for the last 4 games, you saw the best team in the country come together and just steamroll through everybody in the country. I don't think if we had gone through that, we would have been as resilient in the playoffs than if we had not gone through it before. Could we have still won it? Yeah, probably, but wouldn't have been as resilient. And so I think that's just a great example of what we're talking about here. We're talking about mental health. And I think we all need to make sure, for leaders in the community, that we're helping the younger generation understand this. And a big part is having these conversations and being vulnerable and having conversations with your kids. And, I find myself, okay, I'm in the car, I'm with my son. Am I going to have a conversation right now about mental health, or am I just going to talk about something else? And I think the more we can do these types of things, the better it is. A couple of the other things that I think are good reminders that I think help our players in terms of keeping them mentally healthy is, one, is perspective. Perspective. You can think that your world is coming to an end, and then you go to the hospital and you see somebody sick who maybe only has about a week to live, and all of a sudden it changes your whole perspective on life. Perspective is critically important. The natural order of the world is chaos. Like, we will live in a completely crazy world right now in college football with the NIL and the transfer portal and everything that's gone on. But there's chaos going on and always has been going on. So we have to embrace that and understand that change is going to happen. So I think perspective is critically important. I think it's important to have a support system in place. Having truth tellers. We're communal people, and we want to have people around us that will tell us the truth. Mine is my wife. Even when I don't want to hear it, she's going to tell me the truth and look me in the eye. But also having a support system when something isn't going quite right. I know who I go to, and I say, listen, I need a little help right now. We got to get this figured out. And maybe it's just a quick conversation, or maybe it's more than that. And then you get yourself back on track and you go from there. But there has to be a support system in place. And I think that's for young people and also for adults. Again, having a plan is very important to me. And, since my wife and I have become advocates here in the community, I can't tell you how many times we get phone calls from friends or community, people in the community who are like at their last limb. They don't know what to do. Somebody is really, really struggling and in a bad place, and they call us to say, what do we do? And sometimes it kind of puts us in a tough spot, but we just kind of forward them to the right folks. But they never thought it would happen to them. They never thought it would happen to their kids, to their husband, to whoever. And so having a plan in place for when these things happen and getting out in front of them, I think, is important. Last couple of things. I think balance is important. And when I say balance is what I've learned from a Navy SEAL, Clint Bruce, is not equal distribution of time and energy. As a football coach, it just doesn't work that way. We work around the clock. but it's what we call building high ground for hard times. So hard times are coming, adversity is coming. When those things come, you're going to rely on three things: your faith, your family, and your friends. And so we better invest in those three things when we have an opportunity to. When I'm not coaching football, that's what I think about. Invest in your faith, your family, and your friends, because that's what's going to get you through those hard times. But that has to be invested in when you have opportunities to. I think it's good to have a physical outlet. So we say there's physical health and mental health, but I think they go together as well. I found tennis for me has been unbelievable. You know, and when you leave, you're in a bit different mind space when you get physical, you know, whatever, you know, your physical outlet is, running, jogging, some sort of sport. But for me, it's been tennis. I go in there and I just hammer that ball and curse and yell, and then I walk out and I'm better. I'm in a better headspace than where I was when I entered. And it's made a world of a difference for me. And then I think the last thing is being aware. Being aware. You know, for all of us to have these conversations. And I think there's also a little bit of a stigma, like if I'm talking about mental health, that like, you know, there's like this weakness about you. It's not. It's actually a sign of strength when you're working on your mental health. And that's where I think, you know, we have to really flip that entire conversation. It is a sign of strength to make sure you're mentally strong to be able to handle what's down the road. And so, you know, we all have an obligation to help each other. And so I just appreciate everybody being a part of this, taking this very, very seriously. And, you know, hopefully we can do a lot of great things here in Columbus. So thank you. Appreciate you guys.
To all the Performance Columbus family of dealerships, I'm very, very blessed to have, in my opinion, the best leaders in well, not only Central Ohio, but as far as I'm concerned, the United States. Because it's not always easy, I don't think, to be as hard as they work in business and hard as we work in business and all the associates we have. It's even more difficult when we have the standards that we keep with being philanthropic and giving back to the communities. And these guys do a great job with that. So we just want to just take a second and say thank you for coming and speaking today, and also give you this check from our group to your foundation for $20,000.
Thank you very much. Thank you.